I started getting interested in carbon markets in the sort of late 1990s because I saw them as one of the more interesting attempts to internalize an externality, to use economic language. And what that means is that our economic system is very good at putting prices on some things, but very bad at taking into consideration a number of aspects of how our society works and how our environmental systems work. So, for instance, a tree has value only when it's cut down in our economic system. Its value is the wood when the wood becomes a product that people buy and pay for. Even though that tree is doing a whole lot of other things before it's cut down, it's protecting biodiversity, it's providing clean air, clean water, what you call ecosystem services or environmental services are not taken into account in our economic system. They are external to it. They are externalities. And it's a known economic malfunction of our system. We know there are malfunctions. We know our economic system is not very good at understanding and putting a value on certain things. And so we've been, economists have been arguing and discussing about how to internalize externalities for decades. And one of the biggest, in my opinion, has been, the impact of our industry and life on this planet on climate. And to me, kind of the first sort of attempts to put a value on carbon emissions began in the late 90s through the creation of these carbon markets. Now, the carbon markets did not spring out of nowhere. There were markets that had been developed in particular for sulfur dioxide in the United States. So we've seen that happen before carbon. And they worked beautifully with sulfur dioxide. They helped the US control an acid rain problem it was having as a result of sulfur dioxide emissions. But what was different about carbon in the late 90s was that there wasn't a government move to create these markets. They were voluntarily springing up. And the first deals ever were some deals that were done by US electric utilities who had seen the sulfur dioxide trading markets with conservation organizations to protect Latin American forests. And I got very excited about that because at the time I'd been working with conservation organizations, and I saw this as the first sort of attempt to really internalize these externalities. So I started following them. In the late 90s, I helped create a thing called the Ecosystem Marketplace, which was a news and information site kind of following the emergence of these new markets for ecosystem services. And carbon being kind of one of the premier ones emerging, I started following it much more closely. So we created this website that was tracking carbon projects, tracking projects in biodiversity markets, tracking water markets. And as carbon was beginning to really take off in the voluntary space, we also saw initiatives like the Chicago Climate Exchange. We saw, even discussions in the US Congress about the creation of US carbon markets, etc. And we began publishing an annual overview of the voluntary carbon markets. This was around 2004. And I wrote a book about the voluntary carbon markets in 2005. And, obviously a lot has changed since 2005. And a lot has changed in the last 4 years, even in the voluntary carbon markets. There's been an incredible surge of demand for carbon. So a lot has been changing, but I've been watching it as it changes and been fascinated by the creation of these standards, which I was, in the room for At the time, it was called the voluntary carbon standard, then became the verified carbon standard, and now is Vera. Also, I wrote articles about what was then called California Climate Action Registry, which became the Climate Action Reserve, one of the other standards, around when American Carbon Registry was created. So, we saw that creation of some actual registries that were trying to standardize and bring coherence to these markets, which had been entirely voluntary until then. And, I think they've done incredible work of standardizing these markets, and sure, they have their problems and we could always do better, but they were created for a reason. A lot of the issues that they have tried to deal with are important issues that need to be dealt with. And then we come to today, where there's an incredible surge of interest in voluntary carbon markets. Companies left and right are taking net zero pledges. And then we have a new technology on the block, which is the blockchain, as a way of addressing some of the issues that might have plagued the early markets. So, I've been watching and trying to get call it the carbon old guard, people who have been involved in trying to create these carbon markets. And yes, like anything, making mistakes, but also doing some really good work, to see the kind of new kids on the blockchain that are setting up, ways to address some of the problems of the voluntary carbon market. And there's been a kind of a little bit of a standoff, right? For some time, the sort of old guard saw this blockchain as, crazy technology full of scams and other things, and like, oh my God, we don't need this, right? There's already distrust of carbon markets. This is going to add to the distrust. And then, the blockchain people feeling like, oh, all these old guard, they were just doing it back then. They're conservative. They don't want to change. Screw them. We're going to go off and do our own thing. Where I find myself now is trying to kind of be a diplomat between these two sides and trying to bring the two sides together. There's a couple of things there. One is their attitudes towards blockchain. The other is their attitudes towards carbon. And then there's their attitudes towards, carbon plus blockchain. And all are kind of different, right? So I think the attitudes towards blockchain they're still a little bit suspicious, though some of the more forward-leaning types are digging in, and it's becoming more mainstream, and people are becoming less afraid of it. I think from the environmentalist perspective, there's always been a suspicion of blockchain, particularly proof of work type blockchains, because of the energy usage, and all the articles that have come out about the energy usage. And, it's a real problem. I think, now that Ethereum has sort of successfully completed the merge, and is now, a proof of stake coin, I think things need to be rethought from the energy perspective. And we'll see where that goes and how that works. There's some things you give up in moving to a proof of stake, but from an energy perspective, it's a good thing. So I think that is going to help to some degree with the blockchain adoption, at least from an environmental perspective. I think attitudes towards carbon they're kind of new and tender, in the sense that a lot of people have not done much carbon, and then they're starting to get involved in carbon. And as carbon becomes more of a word in people's mouths, and people see it and understand it, it also becomes more visible and is also more open to attack, right? And I think we've seen these attacks, and I think we've seen some of them, purely politically based, and some of them, real serious people who have concerns about the way the system is working. And then you have, popularizations of those concerns through things like John Oliver's segment on the carbon markets or whatever. While I don't think he got it right, I think he got it wrong in many respects. I do think that some of these criticisms are real and need to be addressed. And I think the markets are trying to address them, right? I remember a time when there were no standards in the voluntary carbon market. That was not good. I think the standards brought a lot of benefits to the carbon market and brought us to where we are today. Do I think the standard can get better and change? Sure, for sure. I would like to see them work with the blockchain folks to make those changes. I think we're also seeing a supra-standard entities emerge, and by that I mean the Integrity Initiative for the Voluntary Carbon Market and the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative. These are attempts to address some of the issues in the carbon market. The main criticism that a lot of people level is carbon trading is not enough to address climate change, and I find that ridiculous. Nobody's saying it's enough. It's part of a broader solutions. The other one is they say, okay, well, it stops people from doing what they need to do, which is reduce emissions. And I think that's a misunderstanding of the way carbon markets work. I think they don't take into account the fact that putting a value on carbon actually changes people's behavior in some pretty interesting ways. And I think we see that happening. So I think it's a long-winded answer to your question, but I would say that we are just beginning to see corporates take carbon into account, but there's a pushback. People saying carbon markets are not the way, they're no good, they don't help, etc. I think that criticism is wrong-headed, and I think it's the wrong approach. So hopefully that won't dampen the interest of corporations on carbon. I think a similar thing is happening in blockchain, in the sense that there's a lot of suspicion of blockchain, and it's seen its shares of Ponzi schemes and scams, and so people still associate it with A, too much energy use, and B, Ponzi schemes and scams, and this is just fizzle out. I don't think that's right either. I don't think it's going to fizzle out. I think it's a transformative technology, and one that we need to, figure out how to use correctly, which is kind of why I'm excited to work with Thallo, because I see the Thallo as one of the organizations that is kind of saying, not everything that came before us is stupid and crazy. There are some benefits to existing standards. There are some benefits to the work that's happening and that has happened over the last 20 years. But at the same time, there's this new technology that we need to understand how it can transform and make this market better for the rest of us. So I think eventually we will, what was that famous quote, that Americans always do the right thing after exhausting all the other options. I think business is going to do the right thing in terms of carbon and blockchain after exhausting all the other options. So it won't be quick. We'll get there. I've seen all sides of the carbon market, right? From the NGO perspective, from an outside observer perspective, from a regulator's perspective, from, we had a carbon fund that we were investing in, and we were buying carbon assets and creating carbon projects. So I've seen a lot of change over the years. I think we're in a really important moment when climate is becoming such a big deal that there is a push to do something about it. And so now the question is much more of what does that something look like? And I think the carbon markets are going to be an important part of it, an important part of helping push us towards the transition. But the carbon markets need to be done right. And, they need to be done in a way that encourages reductions, not just, buying your way out of a problem. And I think the people that are doing carbon right are doing both reducing emissions and, buying carbon credits and helping others reduce emissions. So done right, I think it's going to be a powerful tool going forward. And I think for it to become that powerful tool, it's going to need and require updating of the technologies that blockchain provides. And, those technologies are are going to be central in tracking and traceability of carbon credits. They're going to be central in the creation of markets. They're going to be central bringing in the retail sector to the carbon market. Carbon markets have been predominantly wholesale. And by that I mean businesses buying large volumes of tons from producers pretty much at a wholesale level. Very little retail carbon credits. Through intermediaries there's been some, but very little direct. I think tokenization of carbon is going to potentially change that, bring retail sector in a much bigger way. And by retail I don't mean big stores. I mean actually individuals being able to buy carbon themselves for themselves, and that I think is a radical transformation. I also think that there is some potential for transformation in the way carbon projects are monitored, reported, and verified, so MRV in the carbon markets. I think we're seeing satellite technologies and other technologies emerge that is going to make all of that easier. And I think blockchain play a role in how that data enters the information space within carbon. So I think there's a lot of roles for blockchain to play.